Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on restorative justice in Title IX. I'm Dr. Laura McGuire, and today this presentation is brought to you by EEO Now and the National Center for Equity and Agency. I want to take a moment to introduce you to our esteemed guest, Kim Schrader, who is one of the leaders in Title IX and restorative practices in the country and is a participant in our program for certification in this competency. Kim, would you take a moment and tell us a little bit about yourself, where you work, and what you do?
I will. Thank you. I'm very honored to be a part of this program. I have learned a lot from you and from your work, and so I feel very gratified to be a part of this program and to be a part of the conversation of advancing this kind of work in the Title IX space. I've been doing Title IX work since about 2013, during a period in which it seemed like there's been new guidance almost weekly, if not daily. My school, like many others, felt as though we were scrambling every day to meet our legal expectations, but also to really stay focused on the needs of our students in our community. My college, Knox College, was founded in 1837, and it's always been a private independent college. We were among one of the first institutions that were open to people of color and also to women. So from the very beginning, the idea of justice has been a part of our mission and values. We are a community of diverse people. We have this commitment to put learning into action to realize people's personal and also social goals. We've been committed to equitable access, to foster learning that has this real sense of proportion for living with purpose, and also, though, to contribute to the well-being of other people. Our college seal contains the word veritas, which in Latin means truth, or as a phrase means truth is mighty and will prevail. So when you think about that, that really imparts this sense of fairness or equity when it comes to any kind of wrongdoing or harm. So I was a member of the Knox community for many years before I was doing Title IX specific work. But throughout my career and history at Knox, the idea of restorative justice has always been something that felt to me like it had tenets in our culture. So when I started doing when I started doing Title IX work, finding ways to incorporate restorative practices into that work around discrimination, around harassment, and around sexual and relationship violence, right? That's really evolved. And many times it's been limited by forces outside of college policies and procedures. Thankfully, we have experts that actually study these things. You're one of them. And it's now widely recognized and documented that these kinds of cooperative processes empower people to have a meaningful role in how they reconcile their experiences, and how that makes real and often life-changing difference in their lives. And that's true for people on both sides of an experience, right? Whether the folks have been harmed or whether they are folks who have perpetrated harm on other people. Often without intention or it being on someone that they care deeply about, and to be able to recognize that harm and to really feel that as a part of their identity. So part of my role as a Title IX coordinator became very clear early on was to oversee an equitable and supportive response to people. And that's what I do, and to have to be at the helm of impartial processes. So very early in the work, it became important to me to identify and dismantle barriers to people disclosing their experiences, to destigmatize help-seeking behavior. And what I was hearing from people who were victims and survivors was that they wanted these non-adjudicatory options as a way to amplify their voice in the resolution process. And in the same way, people that I spoke with that had been accused of perpetrating harm, causing harm, when many times when those people learned the impact of their actions, They wanted to change, right? They wanted to learn from what had happened. They wanted to be able to take steps to make sure that they didn't repeat those actions, or that people that they cared about didn't, force those actions on other people, or didn't behave in those ways to other people, as part of their path to sort of understanding their experience. And so I feel like my experience in Title IX has really grown up with Title IX over the last decade, right? I'm committed to my institution, to the mission and the values of my institution. I feel like they are a part of my identity. I say to people all the time, right? I've loved my Knox experience. And my goal in this work is really to give other people who become members of our community the opportunity to also love their experience, right? And to do that, that means that we have to have systems in which we can address things that don't meet our behavioral expectations, and that's really at the core of the work that I do. So
yes, thank you
yeah,
for that wonderful foundation for this conversation. You brought up so many good points, and I want to kind of touch on a few of them a little bit further. So number one is that, yes, this is something I think that has grown up over the past almost 10 years. You and I got into Title IX work at a similar time. We saw some of these early conversations coming in, I think, more strongly around 2015, 2016, when there were more conversations, backlash,
yes,
examination, I would say, from OCR on how respondents were being treated. And this concept of, if we just say, we're going to have punitive actions, we're going to expel students, or, the other option is we don't believe survivors and we don't support them. Obviously, those are both ways the pendulum can swing that, don't make sense, aren't the goal of Title IX, and don't create any productive outcomes in any of these situations. And so OCR starts to say, there needs to be a closer examination on what would it look like to fully support survivors, be survivor-centric, and really understand where the respondents are coming from. What are the other mitigating factors that are going on in their lives and in the community that are leading to these issues? And how do we address that holistically? I know for myself, I really started to put those pieces together when I visited the United Nations and saw what they were doing with war crimes, with the most egregious of crimes against humanity, and working with the victims in saying, what does justice look like to you? And applying many of these, like we're saying, practices, knowing that sometimes restorative justice in its full sense can't be actualized, but there are almost always components that can be brought in some measure. So I'd love for you to speak a little bit to, what are some of the ways that you've seen taking these pieces, bringing in some of these practices, work in some of the cases that you found positive resolution for?
sure. And I mean, I can only speak from my experience in our community. I certainly have heard other stories in other places, but for us, ours is really, we're a small residential community, right? And that's often something that people recognize as a strength of our community, right? Like a sense of connection with the people and the community around us. So these kinds of things are amplified, right? The fact that if there are two parties involved or two or more parties involved, it doesn't matter how many are involved. These are not experiences that are just lived by the actual parties who are involved. They are lived by the people who surround those parties, right? Their roommates, their families, their teaching faculty, right? The custodians maybe who work in their building, the people that they work alongside, the people who serve them meals, right? These are experiences that involve lots and lots of folks in our community. And so really understanding that harm is occurring to the people who are at the center of the event is important, but that's harming our society, our community, our culture as a whole, right? And so finding ways to address that then is really offering, right, the opportunity for this sort of broader sense of justice, right? And people come to my school because they have a sense of justice, right? Because that's this sort of personal commitment to them. The other piece that I'll say is just the role of shame in our society, right? Shaming people for what they experience, shaming people for how they respond to what they experience, shaming people for what they want to see as a resolution to our experience, right? That's pervasive. And so I really see these restorative practices as an opportunity for us to unpack the humanity that we all have and to honor the dignity of one individual or multiple individuals, every individual's lived experience, right? To help them chart their own path to, maybe understanding is too strong of a word, right? But to better processing at least what their experience has been, and then deciding what they're going to be able to do with that, right? In all of our lives, we have experiences that we don't want, that we didn't ask for, that we have no control over, things that happen to us. And that we have no control over those things. We do have control over what we do with them. And so that's how I really see these restorative practices, as empowering people to make choices that are best for them. And I don't think you can actually make choices that are best for you until you begin to understand your experience, right? Until you begin to explore what your feelings are around what your experience was, to do that in a protective space, to do that in a place where that experience is honored, right? And where you have the opportunity to identify and then change the ways that you want to move forward. And so that's really the way that I see those restorative practices. I mean, practically, sometimes that means having the person identifying, right, the correct initial sort of confidential or protective space in which a person can explore their experiences. And whether that's coming to term with what someone else did to them or what they did to someone else, right? There's value in that on both sides, because that's such an important part of actually having the restorative practice have meaning for people. Sometimes that means an exchange of experiences, not necessarily face to face, but knowing and understanding. I mean, what I hear from people over and over and over is, I just want the other person to understand how this felt to me, right? And again, that's true on both sides. And so charting a path to achieving that understanding can look very different for very different people, but that's what I feel is a part of my role, is me really deeply listening to the people that I'm working with to understand how they define that for themselves, and then trying to identify a common goal first, right? And then to chart a path through which each party can individually arrive at that common goal. So I don't know if that really answers your question. I think practically it can just look a lot of different ways. And I think there's a lot of really good research and sort of practical application of how to do this. But at the core of it, I think it really involves people knowing and understanding and facing their own truth, and then charting a course to be able to live out their truth based on now what is a part of their identity, because this experience becomes a part of their identity forever going forward, and they have to be able to define what that looks like. So
yes, exactly. I often say it becomes a tapestry, a piece of our
absolutely.
tapestry and who we are, right? We're all these strings, all these experiences, and even other people's stories when we're in these roles, the stories that we hear, the people we are helping to process their experience, becomes part of
absolutely.
our mosaic too. I think one of the things that you touched on very, very well in what you were saying, that we were even talking about before we started the webinar, is common myths and misconceptions. Because I think one of the barriers for schools, institutions, and individuals to fully committing to exploring these practices is that they have a lot of ideas of, okay, restorative justice is the same thing as mediation, or restorative justice is the same thing as restorative circles, right? I've heard people say, oh yeah, I already have that training. We do restorative circles at my school. Or they'll say, we can't do it because I don't know where I would do the restorative circles. And I say, you know, it's a lot more than restorative circles, right? This is a whole paradigm. This is a multi-pronged approach, many different types of tools, many different types of approaches. And also, I think a lot of that does a disservice in not understanding the roots of both the theory in Western social sciences, the people who came up with these terms and frameworks, but also its indigenous roots and its global roots.
Right.
That we're not just pulling from, oh, what's been done in the past 50 years, we're pulling from what has been done for centuries in indigenous communities in the United States and around the earth. So I think that the more we have that kind of understanding, the more we start to build those bridges with people who may be hesitant to explore this. So I was curious, you know, when you have either people who come in and say, yes, I love restorative justice, and you're noticing maybe some gaps in their understanding, or people who are resistant to it, again, because they're thinking it's the same thing as XYZ when it's not. What are some of those common things that you see, and how have you tried to kind of manage that?
Sure. I mean, I think knowledge is power, right? And so when I'm talking to folks, having them understand what their rights and options are, and having them understand that in a space in which they've experienced trauma, right? So at the very root of this is having and learning and growing our understanding of how trauma affects our brains, right? And affects our lives in every single way, because that's such a huge component of all of this work. But having people know and understand all of their options is really the first key piece. Because as we talked about and you alluded to, right, like restorative justice is now kind of a buzzword. Like people are using it in so many different ways without knowing or understanding what it is. And it rolls off of people's tongues in a nice way, right? It sounds like something that we want to be a part of, but recognizing the deeply personal work and commitment that it takes to actually having it work is part of the real challenge, right? And it takes all the parties that are involved, right? It takes a party who has been harmed. It takes work and commitment on their part to identify the harms that they've experienced first, right? To identify components of a remedy to that harm and or a way in which that harm can be an address that feels meaningful to them. So you have to have the individual on that side of it be willing to commit to doing that work. On the other side of it, you have to have the person who's caused the harm, they have to have a willingness to acknowledge that whether or not what they did violated a policy, right, it caused harm in some form. And this may be about a policy violation, but at the root of this, it's about acknowledging that harm and equally, right, being willing and committed to taking the steps to address what my role was in causing that harm to the other person. So it takes that real willingness, commitment, and effort from parties on both sides of it to move forward. And I think often we just don't fully understand that this is not a solution that we can slap onto a situation and have it work successfully. I think it has to be chosen by everybody who's involved. I think it has to be chosen in a way that means that they know and understand what they're getting into, and even know that they can move away from it, right? Like for me, this is an option, and if this is what you want to try, yes, we will do the work to do this process. But if at any point in time this doesn't feel the right choice for you, then here are these other sorts of options. So for us, as long as I've been doing Title IX work, we've had alternative processes, right? We've had a range of options that went from formal to to informal or alternative resolutions. OCR has controlled the conditions under which those options have been able to be applied and or how those things have been able to be defined. So utilizing restorative justice principles in matters that involve sex or gender-based violence has not always been an option. I think that using restorative practices, regardless of what OCR tells us we can and cannot do, that is an institutional and maybe even a personal commitment to doing the work. So kind of regardless of how people feel about the 2020 final rule, I do feel like that was a step in the right direction to give institutions the option to apply these sorts of practices in matters where that was the choice of the people who were involved in the experience, to choose what was best for them. So
yeah, exactly. And I think that's such a important thing to clarify with the changing standards and statutes and the ways that OCR words things. And now there's a lot of terms that people didn't use 2 years ago that are, the thing that they're highlighting currently. And that's really confusing for folks who are going to work every day, dealing with crisis management with these different cases and situations, and then trying to adjust constantly to the way administrations move things around. But that restorative practices in themselves kind of do this holistic caring for the ways that things might move in the future, for where things are now. And I think that is one of the things that makes it so different. A lot of the tools we have are only going to be concerned for, something comes out, a new guideline comes out and people say, well, this is concerning this addresses this new guideline. But in 6 months, they're like, okay, throw it out because sorry, you wasted your time and money learning about that. We're doing something else now. And even the way that sometimes OCR will apply what they're looking at now to something that happened during a transitional year or even a few years before, it becomes so complicated. And I feel like we need to acknowledge the emotional labor that Title IX coordinators are doing every day.
Thank you.
To manage all of this. But that, again, restorative practices is beautiful because it keeps and holds space for what is going on now, what is going on in the future. It's being on that cutting edge, not just saying, well, this is staying in compliance. Well, this is, again, a holistic approach to addressing a systemic issue that is bigger than just Title IX. And that then becomes a tool that we can adapt and use in, all situations throughout time. One of the things I want to close on for our time together today is, what are some of the main takeaways that you got from the certification course that you found were applicable to, again, your everyday life and some of the cases that you've been working on?
Yeah, I mean, I learned a lot from the course. The course really opened my eyes and gave me a better understanding of what restorative practices look like, and the actual definition of restorative justice and the importance of those roles. I think what my takeaways are really the importance of listening, right? And of asking the right questions in the right way, right? I, as a Title IX coordinator, don't chart the path, right? I have to sort of know the path, but I have to also be able to identify what a party is saying to me, right? In the way that they are saying it to me, to be able to enable them to get to the place that they want to be. And that's really what I learned in the course, is the importance of not only listening, but how I listen, right? And then how I ask questions to help people get to the answers that are best for them. I'm not scripting those answers. They're providing the answers, but the way in which I ask questions, the way in which I sort of serve as a guide to that process, right? Looking at this sort of big picture, and really sitting in the very privileged chair in the middle, which is difficult for, I think, folks to understand who don't do the work, right? But you are sitting in this very privileged chair in the middle, in which you are hearing and believing the experience of people on very opposite sides of the same conversation. And so serving as a guide to identify what are the outcomes that both of those people are trying to achieve, right? And then charting a path to help them get to where they want to go is really what the course helped me see. The importance of being able to do that, and to do that in a trauma-informed, right, way, in a restorative way, in a way that really recognizes the power that comes from having people understand their experience and to play an active role in defining how that experience will serve itself out in the course of their life, and helping them do that. And I think that's what the course allowed me to do better. Certainly opened my eyes up to the ways that it could do that, and in which it would be effective, right, for people to practice in those ways. So.
Awesome. Well, that's wonderful information and feedback. And I'm so glad that we were able to connect through this work. I've really enjoyed hearing from you and seeing all that you're doing. And I follow your different school groups on social media and see the kinds of consent workshops they're doing, and sexual education conversations they're facilitating about how it intersects with trying to change these paradigms. And I see how all this kind of is congruent and really creates a campus culture that's moving in all of these really wonderful directions. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
I'm at Knox College. My email is an old naming system, but Title IX at Knox will certainly open up all the ways to get to me. I laugh and say my cell phone number is probably in more places on campus than any other phone number. So I hope that I'm accessible to folks. So Knox College, Title IX at Knox College is the best way. And my email address, my phone number, my office number, my cell number are all there. So I also want to say, again, just thank you for this opportunity. I have deep respect for the work that you're doing, and really recognizing the intersectional components of this, right? Social justice across the board, and the ways that our identities intersect with our experiences, and really unpacking those and having those things matter. Consent and sex ed and lived experiences, right? Discrimination, harassment across protected categories and across our identities. None of these stand alone in their own silo. They all really do intersect, and that's something that I really value in the work that you're doing, and the things that I've learned from you, and feel like we really share a common commitment to, which I think has helped. So I'm thankful for thought leaders in the space who are doing work like you are, and I'm really glad to be a part of it. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, the future is bright. Hopefully things are getting better eventually with COVID, and
right.
More of these opportunities for engagement and education and thought leadership really are emerging. And it's so great to meet like-minded people and to support each other, because this is, like I said, emotionally laborious work. It is hard. Some days you think, why are we doing this again? Facing so many barriers, but we encourage each other and we keep each other on that path. So again, thank you to everyone who's been joining us today. We appreciate it. I will be posting this on YouTube, and you can find information for contacting us and Kim there. And again, have a wonderful weekend, everyone. We appreciate your time today. Thank you.